This is my critique of Doug's critique of my critique of atheist critique of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so this video has been a long time in coming, and in all honesty, this video is probably not meant for everybody. In fact, it's only probably for a small group of people. Allow me to explain. A little while ago, I did a video on how skeptics respond to the evidence for the resurrection. Well, that video was basically meant to showcase how different well-known and model atheists or model skeptics, how they tend to respond to the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So people reacted to this video, in particular, a couple atheists and skeptics, some guys who I would consider kind of friends, to be honest. And they made a critique, a review on Pine Creek on that channel on YouTube. They critiqued my video. However, Pine Creek's critique was 2.5 hours long. Him and Cam Spires, Doug and Cam, they critiqued me for 2.5 hours, and I did not have anywhere remotely near enough time to actually respond to it. So this video today, I'm going to give a short, quick summary response. What I'll give you right now is I will give you 8 things that I need you to know if you're going to watch my video and Doug's video, so that you can understand what's really going on here. I want to respond to those 8 things to Doug and Cam, and then I want to give an answer to the scathing critique of me that was offered, the strong challenge offered by Cam, which was, Mike, why is it that you accept some scholarly consensus on the resurrection of Jesus, but you don't accept all scholarly consensus, such as the dating of Daniel? So, okay, so I'm assuming I've already lost half the crowd. Or more, but for those who are interested, I know that you would like to know at least how I'd respond to this stuff. Let me start off by saying this to preface it. I'm just being honest here, Doug. This is not meant to attack you personally, but you know this. I think that you've kind of acknowledged this in our interactions. A lot of Doug's content online is meant to be psychological attacks on Christian faith and on the faith of specifically Christians mostly. It's not intellectual doubts that are trying to be created through solid intellectual reasons. It's more the intellectual veneer of psychological doubt. That's pretty much the main emphasis of what's called street epistemology, which that's what his channel is based upon. He does other things, but it's branched out from that foundation. And I'm gonna skip over all that. Okay, 2.5 hours is just too long. I mean, my response would be 7 hours long now if I was to respond to the whole thing, and then his response to that, it's just, I don't have that kind of time. It's taken me 2 months just to be able to sit down and deal with it at all, because of just the busyness of my schedule and the priorities I have. So there's number one, my first response, point number one. There's a lot of psychological attacks and unrelated complaining. There are more red herrings in the conversation than there are actual, on target moments where Cam or Doug are dealing with something I've actually said or the case I've actually made. A lot of unrelated complaining. You could actually just go and edit his video down, and it would probably be 20 minutes long if you just got rid of all the unrelated stuff, or maybe a little bit longer than that. Now let me get to some of the specific issues. So number 2, my second response. Doug and Cam really criticized me because on my 5-point case, I'll put it on the screen here, my 5-point case for the evidence for the resurrection, how I say there's these 5 points that are historically agreed upon. Historians generally agree on these 5 points. They said, Mike, here's where you're wrong. Your information is just wrong. Mike, you're uninformed and you're unreliable because you're uninformed. There is no historical consensus on point number, I think it was point number 3. I'm not looking at my list right now, but there's no historical consensus on the empty tomb. And so Mike's wrong here. The thing is here, they really milk this thing. I mean, this cow is out of milk by the time they're done talking about it in the course of this 2.5 hour video. But the truth is, I never said there was a historical consensus. And I was very careful and intentional not to say that in my video. So I think, I don't think they meant to misrepresent me here. Doug and Cam, I don't think you did this on purpose at all. But I think what happened is you heard me making the case for the evidence for the resurrection, and in your head you sort of recall atheist rebuttals to that case, and you sort of loaded them in your mind and you're using them against me, even if I didn't use that content. So I didn't say there was historical consensus on all 5 points. There is historical consensus on 4 out of the 5, but not all 5, according to Gary Habermas, who I do think is a good source. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So I didn't say consensus. Now, if you go through and rewatch their video, you'll realize that a lot of the complaining is about me saying there's consensus when there isn't on 1 of the 5 points I made. Well, there is consensus on 4. I didn't say there was on all 5, so it's irrelevant. This is a response not to me, but to some other Christian, someone else other than me. And that's point number 3. Point number 3 is there really is consensus on 4 of the points. Okay, so points 1 through 4, you could actually, and this is how Gary Habermas sometimes presents the evidence for the resurrection. He'll just present 4 of the points minus 1 of them and say, let's just leave this blank. We're not saying it didn't happen. We're just saying we're going to leave it blank, and we'll present 4 points, the 4-point case for the resurrection, and still the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for those 4 points. It's a good historical case for the resurrection. I could have presented that, and if I chose to go down that route, then I would have used the word consensus, and it would have been fair. There is consensus on these things. Another thing that Doug and Cam brought up, where they kind of milked this point too, and it was really irrelevant. Hear me out here, Doug and Cam. You know I'm not attacking you personally, but the debunking, I think it was Cam who brought it up, if I remember right. They debunked this idea that women were unreliable witnesses based on the idea that women could in fact testify in court. Now, it's true that some people, when they're making the case for the resurrection, they'll say the women couldn't testify in court in the first place, and therefore, why would women be the ones to find the tomb empty if it was a made-up story? You don't want women as your central witnesses when they can't even be used as witnesses in court. Except if you watch my video, I didn't say that. Women were considered unreliable and not the best witnesses in general. They could actually still testify in court. So I never made the claim they couldn't testify in court. Here's another situation where atheist responses are preloaded in the head. I should say skeptical, those who reject the resurrection. Those responses are preloaded, and so it's as though you hear me say things I didn't actually say. I try to present, to the best of my ability, a careful, thoughtful case for Christianity whenever I'm doing it. And so I do dodge and avoid saying things like that are going to end up biting me in the butt. And here I'm glad. I'm glad I was careful not to say consensus. I'm glad I didn't say women couldn't testify. Turns out this is a complicated issue. Women were considered unreliable. There were certain situations where they could testify, and other ones where their testimonies were lowered in value. And so yes, but point 4 still, or my 4th point here is that point 2, ladies find the tomb empty, that this still stands as a good historical point. All right, number 5, Habermas. Gary Habermas is really kind of pushed to the side. He's a scholar in the field. This is the guy who comes up, who has provided us with his survey of the literature, where he says of the people in the field who actually write on the topic of the historicity of these elements. Were there really deaths of the apostles, things like that? Was Paul a real person? Did Jesus really exist? Was the crucifixion a real historical event? The people who actually write on this, Gary Habermas goes in and he surveys the literature, and he's the one presenting to us the content, saying, hey guys, there is consensus on this, there's not consensus on that. Now, Cam especially here, and this is more Cam's field, where he likes his big time hobby, maybe more than a hobby, is to read on this stuff. Cam says that Habermas is an unreliable witness, an unreliable person. He's like the woman, right? Back in the day. But this is where, just like women were not considered reliable witnesses to many people back then, I think that Christians are not considered reliable witnesses many times to Cam, unfortunately here. And Habermas, oddly enough, is the guy you're actually quoting, Cam, when you say that the empty tomb is not a consensus report. I mean, he's the guy who's saying this is about 75% of the field that thinks the empty tomb is a historical reality. So what's weird to me is, on points, 1, 3, 4, 5 of the case for the resurrection, Cam says, don't listen to Habermas, that consensus isn't true. But on point 2, he goes, hey, Mike, it's not a consensus. And who does he quote to prove it? Habermas, the guy he's not he's not relying on. I think that this seems to show that there's a bias here against a Christian source. I mean, Christians can do good work too, and that's really Habermas's big case. He gets criticized for it from other people outside of his camp who are Christians, who are mad at him for only doing a historical presentation of the evidence for the resurrection. And they're like, stop it, you can't do that. You're giving the skeptics too much ground or something like that. And so I think he's actually a very good source on this. He seems to always handle his information with integrity. If you want to undermine him, I think that it's going to be now a good point is, how about you actually give a reason to undermine him other than that he's Christian? That would be good. So it's interesting that Habermas is reliable when you want to attack the empty tomb, but he's not reliable when I want to use his content to defend something. Okay, number 6. Let's talk about the empty tomb. I don't think this was said outright in the critique of my video, but the impression I got was that the empty tomb, that scholars by and large, they think the empty tomb may not have happened, and that there's a slow scholarly march to doubting the historicity of Jesus. Now, online, there is a strong growing movement of mythicists, that's for sure. But according to Habermas, the guy who's in the field, who's actually, this is his work, this is his research, this is literally his profession. And I mean, who are you going to quote? Like, if I want to quote physics, I go to the physicists in that field, like Habermas is the guy. So his statement is that about 50 years ago, belief in the empty tomb was minimal, like 4%, 5%, hardly anybody believed in it. And then you get to now modern times, and about 75% think that the tomb was in fact empty amongst those scholars in the field. Why is that important? Because the impression from Cam and Doug is that there's a slow march towards disbelieving in Jesus and the historicity of those events, but it seems as though the opposite is the case. The march has been towards thinking that this is more historical than not, so that now 75%, a growing number, are believing that the empty tomb is historically verifiable. Now, Doug actually told me ahead of time that they were going to be doing this critique of my video, and I offered him one request. I wasn't able to go on live with him at the time. That would have been really interesting to be part of, but I didn't have the ability. So I gave him one request. I was like, Doug, I just asked that you do one thing. I knew he was going to try to ream me in a bunch of different ways. I said, please just do one thing for me. At some point, I want you to answer the hypothetical question. If these 5 things are facts of history, these 5 points, right? The death by crucifixion, the ladies find the tomb empty, the independent appearances of Jesus alive from the dead, violence endured by the apostles, enemies of Christ converted. If those 5 things are in fact true history, what do you think explains them, other than the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually? And so that was my one request. And what I found really interesting is about 2 hours and 20 minutes into the critique of my video, Doug and Cam launch into their explanation. So he says, I'm going to do this because Mike asked us to do this. And I was really clear when I asked him this, please, if it's true. And because in my original critique, I said the problem is atheists will never actually answer the question, in my experience. I'm not saying no atheist ever will, but the ones that I looked up online, the ones I did my critique on in my Skeptics Respond video, they'll never actually answer the question. They'll never give their hypothesis, generally speaking, on what explains those 5 things if they're in fact factual. So Doug's theory, listen to this. I'm going to recount to you what he says. And let me ask you, do you think he answered my question? Because this is important, right? This is about Jesus and his resurrection. Doug's theory is that of the 5 facts, he believes number 1, and he'll grant a version of number 3, but mostly he denies it. And he has a different explanation for number 5. So let me get into it. Number 1, he says, yes, there was a death by crucifixion that happened. And number 2, he says, I reject it. Ladies didn't find the tomb empty. That's not historical. He doesn't seem to give a lot of reason why he rejects it. He just rejects it. Number 3 is only 2 or 3 people saw Jesus alive, or at least had experiences where they had something like an appearance of Christ. It was only 2 or 3 people, in his opinion, and that all of the other accounts are just made up. Like, they just aren't historical accounts. They didn't really happen. I think that this is because he's going to conclude Jesus didn't rise. That's why he's going to say number 3, just 2 or 3 people. It's just more convenient for his conclusion to have that as a piece of evidence. So he denies most of number 3. Number 4, he just denies it. He denies that there was violence endured by the apostles, says there's no evidence. Number 5, he says enemies of Christ was just Paul, not James, and it was only psychological guilt and a vision of some kind produced a conversion. I actually heard this back when I was in college a long time ago. So basically, Doug doesn't even allow for the hypothetical that I asked. My whole point in my video is, how do skeptics respond to the evidence for the resurrection? Doug's response is, I don't respond to the evidence. I deny the evidence. I rework the evidence. And I'm going to say this because I think the evidence is so loud about Jesus rising from the dead. That's why I won't give you a hypothetical if those 5 things are in fact true. I'll rework the evidence. So that's Doug's theory. Cam's theory is even, it's the same thing. Cam says, number 1, the death by crucifixion, he says 50-50. Maybe Jesus existed, maybe Jesus died. I'll give it a 50-50, he says. Now, there's a consensus on this scholarly, but he says 50-50. For number 2, he says it's a 5% chance the woman found the tomb empty. I don't know why he says it's 5%, but there it is. He denies it. Number 3, he denies it. Number 4, he denies it, says it's baseless. Number 5, he says it was only Paul, and he doesn't give an explanation as to why Paul converted at all. No explanation. So of the 5 facts, he denies 4 out of 5, and one of them he gives a 50-50 chance. Does this respond to my question, my request to Doug and Cam? It was, will you guys at least offer your hypothetical scenario if these 5 pieces are factually true? What's the conclusion? And there isn't even a willingness to answer the hypothetical, and that is actually the point of my original video. Skeptics respond to the evidence. So he says everything's vision-based, and Jesus was slowly exalted over time, and the Gospel of Mark was changed and adapted, and all this other stuff, and all that. But these are all just alternate theories that I don't think the scholars would agree with, as much as Cam says, he reads that content. I don't think so. I think that what's happening here is there's a selective use of scholarly data in a atheist apologetic sense in order to boost the case towards mythicism. So my point seems intact. My point was that that the skeptics are not handling the evidence. They're not willing to handle the evidence, and so they'll deny these facts of history selectively using standards they wouldn't use for other facts of history just because they don't want the conclusion. And that's what it seems to be to me. Now let me get to this. There's 2 major critiques that Cam specifically offered of me, and I want to respond to those. I know some people were asking me privately about this, and they wanted to know what I thought about that. Cam says, Mike, why don't you accept all scholarly consensus? Why do you accept scholarly consensus on those 4 facts and a scholarly majority on the 5th fact? Why do you accept that, but you don't accept scholarly consensus about, say, the late date of the book of Daniel or something else along those lines? And this, he really hammered me on this. If you've watched the video, really hammered me hard on it. I just want to say this. I don't think that this is... Okay, I think it's a fair question on one side, but on the other side, it assumes a bunch of nutty things. Okay, so the fair part of it is this. I should have justification if I'm going to just reject scholarly consensus, right? I should have some justification. I think we can all agree on that. And that is my standard, right? I have to have some standard, some reason to reject the scholars on some level. And I do that with, say, the book of Daniel. That was the example Cam gave. I literally have a video called Defending Daniel in my Evidence for the Bible playlist. That's just the title of the video. You could look it up, where I go point by point and I look at the reasons the scholars give for why they date Daniel late. And then I look at reasons why I don't think those are good reasons. And I try to do my best to rise up to that level of responding to that data. I don't just say, I deny it for no reason. I try to give good reasons. I mean, can't that be the only option we have? Well, think about it this way. Am I supposed to say scholars are always right in their consensus, or they're always wrong in their consensus? Wouldn't that mean that if there's a scholarly consensus, it gets locked in place and it can never be changed because there's a scholarly consensus? Like what right would even scholars have to challenge the scholarly consensus? We have to understand that amongst all the scholarly consensus, there's going to be multiple points where they're going to end up having it wrong and they're going to have to change the data. So they have to be open to good reasons for doubting or just denying a scholarly consensus. And that's my standard. My standard is you got to have good reasons for doubting and denying it rather than just denying it. And I don't think we have good reasons for doubting the 5 historical facts around Jesus' resurrection. I think that's that ultimately is the burden of proof is going to be on you, the mythicist or the person who denies the resurrection. That burden of proof's on you. If you just casually throw aside scholars, you just go, Gary Habermas is unreliable. He's Christian. Come on, like, okay, that's not what I do. I don't do that with the scholars of Daniel who say it's got a late date. I don't say, well, they're unbelievers. Pfft, who listens to unbelievers? I don't do that. I look at the actual information. And then finally, number 9, this is the other real criticism that Cam offered of me. And he says in there, and I mean, Cam, you're, like you said it, I know you like me as a guy, and I don't take it like a personal offense, but you said it in order to try to radically undermine my, not my authority, my reliability. To radically undermine my reliability, Cam said that in a private conversation that we had, that he'd asked me about the synoptic problem, and I, quote, said, I don't know what it is, or in Cam's words, Mike didn't know what the synoptic problem was. He'd never heard of it. I tried to find it, I couldn't find it, but in my old syllabus back from the School of Ministry, we have all this information on the synoptic problem in there. And in the old, I've got like 3 versions of evidence that demands a verdict where they deal with things like the synoptic problem. What Cam is talking about, I don't remember that conversation in detail, to be honest. It was a long time ago. Later on, though, we actually had a private discussion where he told me, Mike, you didn't know what the synoptic problem was. And I was like, Cam, I don't know what you're talking about. I know what it is. And he goes, well, what's your theory? Do you believe in, and he gave me the names, all the names of the German guys and their different theories. And I said, look, I don't remember their names and I don't remember all the terminology around it all. I don't really think there's a problem with the synoptic problem in my worldview. I have multiple solutions to that problem that wouldn't bother me in as far as the trustworthiness, inerrancy of the Word of God. Multiple solutions I'd be perfectly happy with. So I don't think the synoptic problem is a challenge to the Christian faith, so I haven't spent a whole lot of time on it. And so I admit that, right? And then he took me as saying that I didn't know all of the German lingo and the different names for the different theories for how you resolve the synoptic issues. He took that as meaning that I was just utterly uninformed. I mean, I don't, maybe I've read them, maybe I don't remember them, I don't know. I don't care to try to present myself as the scholar of all things. What I want to do is say this. Look, maybe there are even things I just don't know at all. The question is, on the stuff I do say, is it accurate or is it not accurate? So this was, I think, a red herring. I think it was inaccurate, but I also think it was a red herring. I didn't say I never heard of the synoptic problem, didn't know what it was. I did say I didn't know all the terminology of all the people who've tried to resolve it, and I still don't. Even though I read up on it, I just forget the names. I forget the different theories because everything doesn't stick in your head. Maybe you're that kind of person. Maybe Cam, you have a better memory than I do, but I don't remember it. And because I'm so focused on defending the Christian faith, I just prioritize what I think is important to know about these issues. And since I don't see that as a challenge to the Christian faith, I don't really focus on that particular issue, the synoptic problem. So I hope that, I'm being as open and honest as I possibly can. If you watched my video, Skeptics Respond, and then you watched Doug and Cam's critique, I hope this video gives you a filter so that you can see Doug and Cam's critique with, I think, more perspective, right? There was a variety of things. There was red herrings. There was changing the subject. There was saying that I said consensus when I didn't. There was attacking the idea of women not being able to witness and be witnesses in court, which I never said either. So these are 2 things that I never said. There was attacking Gary Habermas, but then using Gary Habermas to attack me. That seems kind of interesting. There was attacks on me not agreeing with all scholarly consensus, which nobody does in the world. Nobody agrees with all scholarly consensuses on everything. So that seems like a really sneaky way to come at me, and acting like I had no foundation for when I don't agree with the consensus, which I think I do. And then there was, kind of almost a personal attack about my own ability, or my own ability to know about these things, my own education. And that attack was really a misrepresentation of a conversation. I got the feeling in that original conversation that Cam was looking for the limits of my knowledge. What does Mike not know about? And so that they could kind of attack that. I feel like Doug's done that too. Like he wants to know what I don't know about so they can go after that. And that's fine. I understand. I take it as a compliment that you even want to find that about me. I take it as a compliment. I take it as a compliment that maybe the content I've put online, the stuff I do know about, has been solid enough and good enough that it made you want to find something else to attack me with. I consider that a compliment. And for anybody who's stuck around this far, I just want to say thank you very much. I do appreciate you being around. I think these dialogues and discussions happening openly and fairly on YouTube and different environments are a fantastic, fantastic thing, because when we can showcase two sides, we can hopefully find truth. Not truth in the middle, like one side, they're both wrong. And no, truth as in the two sides make cases and they banter back and forth. We try to get rid of logical fallacies, personal attacks, and all that, and get down to what really happened, especially when it relates to Jesus Christ, when it relates to God or the Bible. I think that when I first started researching and reading into the evidence for Christianity, that the evidence for the resurrection was some of the most beautiful stuff in the world to me. I was so encouraged by what solid evidence there was. I was like almost shocked that I didn't hear more pastors and more Christians talking about this stuff. I couldn't believe after 2,000 years, God had preserved enough data and ancient information in a world where, there's hardly anything about the first century that was kept around to know about. But God preserved this information that we might know that we have a foundation for our faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think it's awesome. I think it's awesome stuff. So, Doug and Cam, thank you for giving me the opportunity to interact. I hope you hear all this with a gracious attitude. But I will say I think that systematically throughout the course of your video, it's just a series of psychological attacks, misrepresenting what I said, changing the subject, going off on red herrings, other issues, and ultimately then we come back to the issue of you're not handling the evidence for the resurrection. You're not even looking at the things fairly, in my opinion. If you want to say that Habermas is wrong, then I think you need to go and do a survey like he has to stand upon that data, and then you can refute him. But don't do it because he's an untrustworthy Christian. I mean, that could be flipped on you just like that. You're an untrustworthy non-Christian. And in fact, Christians have an actual moral imperative to speak truth from Jesus Christ himself. And so I think that kind of backfires as well. So thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will be putting up a video on Ji Chul Kim coming up pretty soon. This Mother God movement guy. I'm working through his book, taking notes to show exactly where and how he twists the Bible to mess with and harm the members of his group. They need to be rescued from this guy and his false teaching. So that's going to be coming out hopefully within the next few weeks. God bless you.